So we know that the test is going to be around 2 hours. The important thing is it's shorter than the last test. There's still the reading and the writing in the math section. And then each of the sections themselves, reading, writing, and math, have those 2 modules for the total of 4 modules across the test. This is that quote that I read by the College Board. Basically, like I said, it's adaptive. And so the first module is that mix of easy, medium, and hard. And then the performance on that dictates what kind of module the student will go into in the second module. And remember, this is going to happen on the reading and writing section. The 2 modules are adaptive. And then the separate module for math, the first one, resets to the easy, medium, and difficult questions. And then they get routed into the second math module as well. So again, like we said, the maximum score is going to be lower if you're not able to get routed into that harder second module. And so the only way to get that perfect 800 is to get to that harder second module, which we said was about roughly half of the first module's questions answered correctly. Now here's the timeline. This is probably one of the most important things that we're going to touch on tonight. For students in the United States, we're not going to see the first digital SAT until this time next year, spring 2024. However, for international students, they began this month in March with their first digital SAT test. Now, for students in the United States who are taking the PSAT, that test will be digital this fall. And that way, any students who are juniors in the fall, so sophomores now, can get familiar with the digital version of the test before they take the SAT in the spring. So the PSAT will be in the fall, digital, and then digital SAT in the spring on that same timeline. And of course, there are small, asterisks, right? Caveats. Some students are gonna still take it on pencil and paper if they have special testing accommodations that allow for that. But otherwise, of course, everybody is gonna go digital when the test goes digital. Now, a couple cool things about the test. There's gonna be a way that a student can flag questions to return to them later. There's going to be a countdown clock, which will show them how much time is left on that section. But there's also a way that you can hide that. So if you don't want to see the time or that's stressful, you can hide that. There's a way that you can cross out or have the system cross out answers that you want to eliminate. There's also a built-in calculator that can be used on the entire math section. And we'll talk in detail about this a little bit later. There's a reference sheet with math formulas, just like we're used to with the current SAT. And instead of waiting weeks to get your scores, you're going to be able to get them back in a matter of days. Now, this is a snapshot of the in-app testing environment. This is what you're going to see when you take the test. And so you could tell that up near the top of the question, there is a little thing that you can mark for review, as we mentioned. At the top, the very top in the middle, you can see the timer, which you have the option to hide. You can see that I've crossed out a couple of the answers. A and B I figured out were wrong. So I was able to cross those out just so that I know, okay, I'm not gonna pick those. And that lets me see that I'm just gonna narrow it down to C and D and pick from there. The calculator is built in, as I said. So on the top right, you can opt to select the calculator, which has popped up on the screen. And you can even expand that. So obviously right now, this little calculator on the left is very tiny, and you could still see stuff well enough, but there's a way that you can expand it to make it bigger so that you can answer the questions with the calculator. And did I mention, you could use the calculator on the entire math section. So no calculator SAT math section starting on the digital test, which is really, really cool. And this here is the reference sheet of formulas for the math section that we're all pretty used to if we've seen the PSAT or SAT. So that's not really changing. And we have all these formulas that you can just pull up from this little reference thing on the top right of the screen in that testing app. So all of that will be right there for the student to see if they need to reference anything. Now, just a little bit of a breakdown before we get into some of the practice questions. The current SAT math section has 58 questions. You have 80 minutes to do it. And that comes out to about 1:23 seconds per question. On the digital test, less questions, less time, 44 questions in 70 minutes, but the average per question goes up a little bit. So students will have a little bit more time per question on the digital test. Now, of those 44 questions, roughly 33 of them, or 75%, are going to be multiple choice. And then the other 25% or so will be student produced responses. Now, there's not going to be any more bubble sheet. So students are just going to be able to type in their answers into the testing app for those student produced response questions. As far as topics go, this is kind of a lot of information. So I'll just highlight a little bit of maybe the most important stuff. 70% of the test or so is made up of the first two bold categories there, algebra and advanced math. And you can see some of the categories or some of the topics within these categories. Solving equations, of course, solving inequalities, systems of equations. And then in advanced math, you've got quadratics, exponential functions, and these, like I said, make up about 70% of the test or so. And then the rest of the 30% is made up of the other two topics, or the other two sections: problem solving and data analysis, and geometry and trigonometry. Now, one topic that we've heard is not going to show up on the new digital test that's on the current one is complex numbers. So any problems that have imaginary numbers, square roots of negative numbers, when you see an I with the radical, that kind of stuff, those are complex numbers. Those aren't going to show up on the new digital test, but basically everything else will. And so topic-wise, it doesn't really change too much from the current version of the test. Now, the College Board has already released 4 full-length digital adaptive practice tests. And we've found in our little bit of a deep dive into those tests that close to half of all of the math questions are coming from the 8 topics that we see here on the right side. So, and I'll go into more detail about what each one of these looks like on the test, but basically we've got finding an equation to fit some data, solving equations, systems of equations, exponential functions, and you could see the rest of the list there as well. Now, a lot of those, of course, are from these top 2 topics, as you would expect, the algebra and the advanced math. But it's cool to see that in just these 8 pretty major topics, we've got basically half of the whole test, and then everything else is just kind of peppered in a little bit here and there as well. So what do these look like? So these names are names that we came up with just to kind of describe the question types in a little bit more detail. So that first major one that came up more than anything else on these practice tests was we called finding an equation to fit the data. So basically, an example would be, here's a table, x and f of x values, and it says that there's some function that's linear that goes through these points, right? Or it has these values of x and f of x, and we need to figure out which equation defines f of x. In other words, fit the function to that data. Now, there's ways that you can do this. A lot of us maybe know how to do this, or students know how to do it rather quickly, but with the new tool Desmos, which is the calculator that we'll talk about in a little bit, there's also a way that we can do this one. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. The solving equations one on the right of the screen, that's pretty straightforward. We have an equation, we need to solve for the value of x that makes the equation true. Systems of equations, this one is very intimidating looking, especially with all of these crazy looking fractions. And they say the system has no solution. What does that mean? What's the value of p? So that made up about 6% of the test so far of all the ones that they've released. Exponential functions on the right side of the screen. If you look at each of the answers, we've got exponents, we've got variables in the exponent, and we need to figure out the equation that models the relationship shown in the question. Continuing on with numbers 5 and 6 of the 8, we've got linear relationships. This looks pretty intimidating. We've got an equation that models some scenario and Hannah's bank account. She's depositing money, and we need to figure out what the 25 means in the equation. We need to interpret that linear function. On the right side, we have finding intercepts. This is straightforward as well. We need to just find the y-intercept of this graph. Now, as you might imagine, with the use of a calculator available, knowing that this is something that we could find on a graph, it might be easy to just type this one into the calculator to find the answer, and sure enough, we could. The last two from those top 8, quadratics. So we've got quadratic functions we have here negative x squared. That's the giveaway that it's a quadratic, but it's intersecting this line. We need to find the value of c. We've got some messy answer choices. I think this is one that we're going to look at a little bit later in the calculator on how to solve it. And then finally on the right, evaluating functions at a given value. We've got a function. They ask us, what's the total number of people on a company retreat with 7 managers? Well, because X is the number of managers, they tell us, that means we could just take 7 and we could put it into that function in place of X, and we should be able to evaluate it and solve for the answer that they're looking for. Now, as I've been hinting at, my favorite feature of the new digital SAT is Desmos. Now, Desmos is a very popular, well-known digital graphing calculator a lot of students probably already use, or at least are familiar with. This is going to be built into the test, as we saw earlier, and all the students can use it. Now, they can still bring their own graphing calculator if they're more comfortable with it, but we would encourage all students to get familiar with Desmos because of how easy it makes a lot of the questions and how simple it's going to be to just pull it up on your screen when you're taking the digital SAT. And like I said earlier, this calculator can be used on all of the math questions, so goodbye, no calculator section. And one of the reasons that I love this feature so much, and I would encourage students to take advantage of it and use it now as often as possible, is because of that last bullet point there. In looking through those new digital SAT practice tests, we found that somewhere around 30 or 40% of all of the math questions can be solved using Desmos. Now, of course, students need to know what to look for when they're looking at the graph to find the answer, but still, that's a big amount of questions that could be solved using that built-in calculator. So let's take a look at Desmos and let's see if we can figure out some of these questions. Now, before I make the same mistake as I made earlier, I want to make sure that I'm sharing the right tab and that you guys can see me on when I use Desmos. So let me just make sure that I've got that open, and I'm just gonna set it up, and you guys can take a look at this question and maybe see how you might be able to solve it. And I bet that maybe looking at it, you could see that it's probably going to be best if we were able to use a calculator. So the question says that here B is a constant, and it says for which of the following values of B will the equation have, what does it say? More than one real solution. So like I said, if we're going to use the graphing calculator, we need to know what the heck we're looking for. So what are we going to look for? Well, why don't we start by typing that equation in? So 64x squared plus bx, and then it said plus 25 is equal to 0. Now, one thing that I've noticed in playing around on Desmos when I've been working on these questions is that if I type in an equation like this and I put in equals 0, for whatever reason, Desmos gives me this error on the left side. You could see the exclamation point in blue there. So I'm just going to take away the equals 0 part, and it's going to be happier about that. But you might have noticed here that it says add slider. So what that means is if I tap that B button, it's going to give me what's called a slider for the value of B. And if I zoom out my picture a little bit so that we can maybe start to see what's going on here, you can see that the graph currently is up at the top of the screen. Now, like we said before, we need to know what the heck to look for. So let's go back to the question and let's analyze it a little bit more. It specifically says that we want the equation to have more than one real solution. Well, in the context of a quadratic like this, a solution simply means an x-intercept. In other words, where that red graph that's currently way high up here is going to cross or touch the x-axis down here. So I want my B value to make it so that that red graph goes down low enough so that it says more than one real solution, more than one x-intercept. So let me do that. And you can see that as I drag this slider, the graph is barely moving. So let me change my values of B. I can tap this number 10, and I can move the slider's values, the range of them, to maybe be a little bit bigger. So maybe I'll go from like negative 100 up to like positive 100. And the step here just wants it or tells it how many to jump up by every time. So if I make it 1, that tends to be pretty good. And you could tell in my answers from negative 91 up to 40 that the range that I picked should be okay. So now I can drag it a lot further, and you could see that that graph is starting to get closer and closer to the x-axis. And now I'm going to zoom it in again, just so that I can make sure that I could see it properly, what's happening. But remember, we want more than one real solution. So now if I make it 81, that is the first one where it crosses. And it seems like any bigger B value than 81 will keep it at more than one solution, again, because it's crossing that horizontal x-axis in two places. And so unfortunately, there is no value bigger than 40, but I need to go to the negatives now, because I bet if I go back to either -80 or -91, the same thing's going to happen in the opposite direction. So now I can drag my slider negative, and you can see that, sure enough, when I hit -80, it touches the x-axis in this one place here. However, once I make that negative number more negative, like -91, like the answer A, then I have more than one real solution. Okay, so the answer, long story short, turns out to be A, -91. Now, just a little bit of a breakdown of this before we move to the next one. Of course, in order to use that tool, the graphing calculator, we needed to know what to look for. And if you don't know what to look for, then it makes it a lot harder. There are also ways that you can use just regular old algebra, namely the discriminant of the quadratic formula, to figure this one out. And so this one is really a matter of what a student is most comfortable with. Of course, if you're using Desmos enough and you know what to look for, then that would be probably by far the faster way to get it, but that's going to depend on each student. All right, let's take a look at another example that we can use Desmos for. This time we have a system of equations. They tell us that we have another constant, t this time, and it says that this system has no solution. They say, what's the value of t? So why don't we go back now to Desmos, and we can erase what we had in there before, and we can type in the new equation. Now this is the tedious part. 4x minus 6y is equal to 10y plus 2. And we can see that that is a nice line. They've graphed it nicely for us. And then the second one turns out to also be a line. Ty equals 1/2. 1/2. And then I believe it was plus 2x. Let me just check. Yep, that's right. Now again, you could see over on the top left that we have the option to add a slider. So let's do that for t. And you can see that if t is 1, then these lines are going to intersect, and they have this nice intersection point down here that Desmos will tell us. They're decimals though. But what are we looking for? Remember, that's always the key in Desmos. What do we look for? Well, they say that the system has no solution. Now, in the context of a system of equations, a solution is an intersection point of the two lines. In this case, if we don't have a solution, then that means that the lines have no intersection points. In other words, the lines must be parallel. That's the key for this question. We need parallel lines, and that's what we want to find when we get our right t-value. The correct t-value will make these lines parallel. So if we move the slider, you can see that as we get closer and closer to, let's see what the answer would be. Maybe it looks like 8. And there we go. 8 would be the correct answer. And if you want to make sure, because you might say, well, what if they eventually intersect a little bit further? You can, of course, zoom out, and of course, you're not going to look forever, but you can kind of get an idea here that these are indeed parallel. The correct t-value would be 8, and that would be the answer to this question. Notice this one wasn't multiple choice, so this is one where we would just type in the answer 8. So we've got a couple more that I think would be fun to go through on Desmos, and then we're basically going to be all done. All right, and so number 3, we've got another system, and you could kind of get, you could maybe see a pattern going on. There's another constant, another a value that we need to find, and so sure enough, Desmos is going to be useful here because we can use that slider tool, which is probably the best feature of Desmos itself that we can use to find these missing numbers. So we'll read the question and then we'll go into Desmos and type it in. So we've got a system, a is a constant, and this time these equations intersect in exactly one point, and they want to find the value of x at that intersection point. So let's go ahead and type them in. 2x squared minus 21x, 2x squared minus 21x plus 64. And that is off of my picture. So zoom it out a little bit and we could see it. And then we've got y equals 3x plus a. Add that slider, and we're going to slide a until these things intersect in 1 point. So let's do that. We're going to move our slider. We can see that it seems like if I go more negative, that they're going to eventually intersect in 1 point right around here. And I'm guessing that based on my a value, it's probably going to be the one that's an integer, not a decimal, so -8. And I'll zoom it in just to confirm. But usually Desmos will, depending on the zoom that you're at, you'll be able to see that intersection point. There we go. So I'll do that again. And as I tap over here, you can see that that intersection point is 610. So we have to be careful on this one. We've made them intersect in 1 point, but they don't ask for the a value. Remember that they asked this time for the x value at that point. And so because the intersection point we saw was here at 610, we're going to pick 6 as our answer. So like I said before, these are questions that we could solve using algebra, but if we know what to look for in Desmos, we can hopefully see that that's a lot faster way that we can get to the solutions. Just a couple more. This is one that we saw earlier on solving equations, and I just want to show you that even a relatively simple equation like this, we can still use Desmos to solve. 55 over x plus 6 is equal to x. So we'll go ahead and type that in. 55 over x plus 6 is equal to x. And if I zoom it out and go back to the view over here, you might be able to see those two vertical green lines. Now, those are actually the way that Desmos shows us the solutions to an equation like this. So we don't have a fancy curve this time, but we do see that the graph crosses the x-axis at -11 and at +5. So we've got two possible solutions for x. However, if we go back to the question, notice that they say, what's the positive solution? And so we're going to pick the positive answer, which would be +5. And as simple as that, we've got it. Now, finally, we've got one more that we'll look at in Desmos. And this one turns out to be an exponential function. And then there's also another function. So they give us f of x, but then they say that g of x is f of x plus 2. Now, first of all, what does that even mean? How are we going to find the function g? And second of all, look at all the answers. They ask us to find that function g, and it might be hard to do it using regular algebra. There's certainly ways we could do it, but let's go to Desmos and see how we can do it in there. So I'm going to type in the first function just as I see it. F of x equals 9 times 4 to the x. So this time I'll want to put f of x equals like this, 9 times 4 to the x power. There it is, a nice exponential function. And then I'm going to go and type in g of x, which they told me was equal to f of x plus 2. So I'm going to type in that exactly as I see it. And notice that the black graph, which is g of x, is the same graph as f, except it's shifted 2 to the left. And you might not know that just by looking at it, but if you pick out like a point here, like -2, 0.563, if you go to that same point over here, you can see that it's -4.563. So that's a way that we can tell that it's shifted to the left. And that's where that 2 comes from in the parentheses. But this still doesn't get us to our answer. So what we can do this time to figure out the actual function that is g there is we can just type in all 4 of these answers until the one that we type in matches that black graph, which we also know is g, if that makes sense. So let's just try that. This shouldn't be too tedious, and we can get to the answer. So is it 18 times 4 to the x? Let's see, 18 times 4 to the x. Remember, we want it to overlap with that black one. That one obviously doesn't, so A couldn't be right. We'll get rid of that. We'll go on to B, 144 times 4 to the x. Ooh, did you see that? It overlapped exactly with the black one. It covered it up, and therefore that blue one, 144 times 4 to the x, must be the function g, and we would pick B as our answer and we would move on. At that point, I wouldn't even test C and D because I've clearly figured out the one that matches with the function g, and that would be correct. So that's all for our Desmos examples. And I hope that that was exciting for you to see. When I first learned about Desmos and how we can use it on the SAT, it got me really, really happy and excited because I know that a lot of students are going to be able to benefit from this. And so my goal in going through those was just to show you how hopefully easy we can use, we can find the answers using Desmos. And like I said, it all comes down to practice. Of course, I've played around with it a lot more than most people. And so it's going to take a little bit of getting used to, but you can see that all the features are in there, and it's really, really cool way to help get to a lot of the answers on our test. So how can we at Method Learning help? Well, we are working, as you might imagine, on our own version of a digital SAT course in our self-paced program, which we call Methodize. Some of you may already be familiar with that program. And we're planning to make that digital SAT course go live around June of this summer. Now, for now, if you're looking to get practice in the meantime, our current Methodize course for the SAT and the ACT is geared towards the current test, but it's still very, very valuable, especially because a lot of the question types, especially on that math section, are staying the same for the digital test. Now, another way that you can practice, of course, is simply by going onto Desmos and using that in your homework assignments or things like that. As you do your practice, use it, and the more familiar you are with it, the easier it's going to be to use it seamlessly come test day. We also have blog posts that we've written on the SAT that give some more information, and I'm going to put the link to that in the chat so that you all can access it pretty easily. So I've just typed that in, and hopefully everybody can see that there if you want to go there and see it. And of course, we've also got the College Board's official full-length practice tests that they have on their website, which I've also shared there in the chat with you. So take a look at those resources. If you are interested in our program Methodize, normally we sell it for $249, the ACT and SAT self-paced course, but because of your participation in this webinar, we wanted to show our appreciation to you by giving you a chance to purchase both for $100 off. And so for $149, if you use this coupon code, which I'll also put in the chat, it should be easy enough to remember it, but there it is. You can purchase the program for $149 for the SAT ACT program. The easiest way to sign up is just to scan that QR code that you see on the screen. So take out your phone, go to the camera, and you probably know how to do that. I'll also share the link if anybody wants to sign up in a different way. I'll put this link here in the chat as well. So that will get you there just like the QR code will. I'll go back to this in case anybody missed it and needs it. And otherwise, that is all that I had for you guys tonight. And so I'd be glad to stick around and answer any questions that you guys might have. I was not the best at monitoring these questions, but it seems like most of them were just related to the screen issue at the beginning. So I want to apologize for that. Thank you guys for sticking around through that. Hopefully this was very helpful for you. We wish you all the best in your studies, and I hope everybody has a great night. Like I said, I'll stick around for any questions, and again, I appreciate you being here. Yeah, so that's a good question, Megan. So scratch paper and pencil, yes, students will still be able to use that to do work on the side. Yeah, good question. The recording will be available. You all should get a link emailed to you just by signing up. So that should automatically get sent to the email you use to register for the webinar some point soon. Does the score come back instantly? So the score, as far as we know, is going to take a couple days. It won't be instant, but it definitely is going to be quicker than the current turnaround, which is about 2 or 3 weeks. Can my student use the current Blue Book to prep for the digital test? Yes, so that's another good question. So I would say basically any of the math material, at least, you can get away with studying from current practice books and tests and things like that. The reading and writing section is changing a little bit more dramatically. We have a webinar coming up on that. if you're interested in it. But as far as the math goes, the content of the new test isn't dramatically different. And so yes, you can get away with studying from current prep materials. The digital SAT will be taken in school. Someone asked, will we take it in school? Yes. So just like you take it now in a school, typically, you will take it in a school come next March and beyond. And the College Board has talked about how, to answer your question, long story short, yes. So it will be able to be taken in a school. And because it's digital, and because every student has basically a different version of the test because of its adaptive nature, there's less, I should have said this earlier, but there's less in the way of fear that cheating is gonna be involved, right? It's gonna be harder to cheat, and so it's gonna be easier for schools to be able to have the test at different times or different days even, because somebody in the Eastern time zone isn't just gonna be able to call up their friend in California and say, hey, number 17 is A. Right? So that makes it a lot easier. Let's see. So someone asked about the content in math, algebra 2 and below, or does it cover pre-calc? It should just be algebra 2 and below. That's a good question. There won't be any anything like limits or continuity from pre-calculus or anything like that, as far as I know. If it does show up, it's on a question, maybe, and it's very rare, but I would say that it shouldn't do that. It should be algebra 2 and below that, but that's a really good question. The digital program that I mentioned, I think this is the question, Methodize, it's self-paced, it's self-led by the students. So the QR code on here that signs you up for our program Methodize, yeah, so students can go on at their own pace at any time, doesn't have to be in school, and they can self-study and move on at any speed that they want and keep practicing for that test. Is there any way we can practice Desmos if our school doesn't offer it? So great question. So Desmos is a free website that anybody can go to. I should put the link for that in the chat, but it's basically this right here. You can Google it. I have it here, desmos.com/calculator, and anybody can use it. So it's free. You don't have to pay for it. They offer it to anybody to use. They even have an app if you want to use the app on your phone. If I have a paper accommodation, can I use the online calculator? Ooh, that's a really good question. And that's one that I don't have a sure answer to, but I assume yes. I would assume that if you have a paper accommodation and you're still taking the test on paper, that somehow they will set you up with the Desmos online calculator. I don't know what that would look like, but I'm guessing yes, based on how they have been accommodating in the past. I assume that yes, you will still be able to use that, even if you have a paper and pencil test. Good question about the SAT and the ACT, the differences between them. So do you need both? So what we typically suggest to students is to take a like a diagnostic test of both and just kind of see which one you tend to do better on, which one you feel more comfortable with. Of course, just because you're more comfortable with one doesn't mean you can't take the other, but both are similar in a lot of ways, and they have some differences, of course. The ACT has a science section. You don't need to know science for it, but there's a lot of graphs and tables, and if you're not familiar with that, I suggest you just Google ACT practice test and you'll see what I mean. The ACT has never had a no calculator section. There's only one math section on the ACT. There's a reading section, there's an English section, and then there's a science section. So they are similar in a lot of ways. I suggest that you look into them and figure out which one, if you're only going to take one, which one you want to take. Look into the schools that you're interested in going to and see what average scores they typically accept for both of those. And then when you take your diagnostic test, you'll be able to see, you know, your how you fare against those acceptance scores for those tests at those schools, and just see how you think you'll do. You know, realistically, is my score going to go up enough if I take this test, or do I think it'll go up higher if I take the other test, right? But that's really a personal decision. Will the digital test be released like some of the current SAT dates? So I think that is asking about the dates themselves. And if that's the case, yes, they will release the dates, but they're not released yet, as far as I know. And like I said a little bit ago, with the fact that the test is digital and adaptive, it gives schools more flexibility. So if kids are going to take like an in-school SAT on a weekday, which is something that some schools may do now, I'm pretty sure. It seems like that would be another option for the digital SAT, which gives, again, more flexibility as far as dates and times go. But the official dates, seems like they're going to release that, I would expect, probably in the next few months if they haven't done it sooner. Can we still bring our own calculator? Yes, you can. You don't have to use Desmos, but you certainly could and probably should, but definitely use your calculator if you're more comfortable with it. Because everything we can do in Desmos, you can do on your own calculator, except for maybe that slider tool. I'm not too familiar with the newest calculators. Maybe there is a way to do the slider, but I'm not sure. So that might be the only thing better about Desmos, but again, I'm not 100% on that. Will students be able to see questions that they answered incorrectly? Ooh, that's a very good question. So as far as I know, no, unfortunately, as far as I know. And that's because every student is going to have a different test, and every question is going to be weighted a little bit differently. This isn't something I talked about earlier, but the way that it's adaptive, some questions, as I mentioned, are easier or more medium or hard, and so they have different weights to them. And so if you get an easy question right, it's almost worth it's not worth as much as if you get a hard question right, which is how the score plays into it. So it's very interesting how they're doing it. They're not telling us everything, of course, as far as where the numbers and the scores are coming from. So to answer that question, it doesn't seem like we're going to be able to see the version of the test we had and the answers that we got wrong, unfortunately. At least that's my understanding of it so far. Will students be able to use scratch paper? Yes, we answered that. They will be able to use scratch paper. Where can I find the recording? It will be emailed to you automatically once I end the call and it processes. You should get a link to it in your email. Thank you, you're welcome. Yes, so Methodize, if you currently use the Methodize program now, or if you purchase it tonight and you start using it, once our digital SAT course goes live, yes, you will have access to it. It'll be updated with the digital version come June when we release that that new program. Let's see. Oh, will the test questions be released? Sorry about that, Hillary. Will the digital test questions be released like the current SAT is on a few days? Oh, you mean like how it's like question and answer service and they release the tests? I'm pretty sure that that will be the case with the new test, as far if I'm understanding it correctly, that we will eventually see another full test from a certain day. I think so, but again, because the test adapts, everyone has a different version of the test, potentially with completely different questions. And so there's not, I'm going to change my answer now. There's not just one version of the test on March 18th, say. And so it wouldn't make sense to release that test because nobody has the same version. So I think only time will tell how they're going to do that. But they have promised that as time goes on, even before next year, they're going to continue to release more practice materials and tests. So we're going to find out more information, throughout the year, even before next March comes and we have the first digital SAT in this country. Will the student know on the second module? Oh man, these are good questions. Thanks for asking them so I could talk about them next time I lead this webinar. Will the student know on the second module if they're taking the easy or the hard one? No. So they're just going to take it as, like normal. It's not going to say you're on the easy module. I suppose that after they take it and they see their score, they'll be able to figure out, based on how many they got right and wrong, which of the two modules they were in for the second module. But no, it won't make an announcement and let them know which one they're in as they take it. Do I think that the online version is harder or the original version in past years? Great question. Personally, I think that the digital version is a little bit easier, probably mainly because of the ability to use Desmos. I really think that that is just the best part about the new math test is the ability to use Desmos. And if you know how to use it and you're proficient with it, then I think that the math section is a little bit easier. The reading and writing section, we didn't talk about this because we were focusing on math, but the reading and writing section isn't going to have really long passages anymore. It's so on the current test, the reading section, you have a big passage. It's like 100 lines of text. It's a few paragraphs worth, and then you do about 10 questions on each of the passages, and then it switches and you have a new passage. Same thing, 100 lines or so. All the questions, all 10 of them relate back to that. On the new test, it's going to be shorter passages, so that's probably less intimidating for a lot of students. However, maybe the downside to that is that the topic is going to change with every question, so you kind of have to be on your toes because it just changes, yeah, per question this time. But I think overall, hopefully students find the new one easier. They say, the College Board says that if you got let's say a 1200 on the current test and you got a 1200 on the new digital test, that the way that they've worked out the scores, that a 1200 on the old one is equivalent, as you would expect, to a 1200 on the new one, meaning that a student's ability level would roughly be the same. So it's supposed to be basically the same in that sense, where a 1200 this year means the same thing as it will next year. The English version of this webinar, I believe, I should know this, but I'm not doing it, so I don't actually know, but I think it's next week, but I'll have to check on that. In fact, I'll probably pause this in a second and just go to get that link and just make sure that the date that I've given you is correct, but it should be next week. So let me just, let me look. Yep, so we have, I'll share this with you now. This is our webinar page on our website. You can go here if you want. I'll put this in the chat and you'll see all this information. But the important thing, next week, a week from tonight, same time, 8 Eastern, is going to be the reading and writing webinar. And this one was scheduled for 45 minutes. And the next one is scheduled for maybe a little bit longer. So there might just be a little bit more information packed into that, but you could expect basically the same thing in that one as we saw tonight, just the reading and writing version of it. Now I'll go back to the questions. Yeah, will a student know if they're being given easier questions? Nope, we talked about that. How does a paper test adjust for the easier? Oh, good question. So if you have an accommodation to take the paper version of the test, even though everyone else is doing the digital one, it's not going to adjust and be adaptive because it's impossible, as your question kind of alludes to, right? And so however they're measuring the scoring and the difficulty of each question on the paper test next year is gonna be well thought out and factored in, but you're still not gonna have, it's not like someone's gonna come up to you and say, oh, you earned this test version versus the easier version or something like that. It's just gonna be one test, and somehow in the scoring they're going to adjust for it and make sure that that your score represents how you did on the test, just like everyone who's going to be taking it on the computer. Yep, reading and writing section we mentioned was next week. Will colleges be able to super score the digital test with the paper pencil test version if we took December and then March? Great question. I don't have an answer for that, but I would assume the answer is yes. So again, if you take the paper and pencil in December, let's say, and then you take the digital next March, can you still super score? And I would assume that you will. I haven't seen anything specifically about that, but I'm going to assume that yes, that would be the case. And it looks like that is all the questions. So if anybody has any more, like I said, I'm more than happy to stick around. This is fun. I'm learning. And I'm sure hopefully you guys have learned a lot too. But there are no more questions in the question portal thing now. So feel free to take off if you want to. Like I said, I will stick around, but if you're gonna head out, thank you so much again. This has been a pleasure. And we hope to see you and interact with you again soon. Best of luck as you take your SAT or ACT. Hey, thanks for watching. Let us know in the comments if there's any topics that you want to see a video on going forward. Be sure to like and subscribe, and check out our channel for more content.